Right, so we're back for yet another amazing episode with our most brilliant guest that we managed to pull into the studio. Thanks so much for being here, dear guest. So before we go to the guest, we have our co-host for this recording. Co-host, please, who are you and what are you doing here?
Hi, I'm Rodney Taveira. I'm a senior lecturer in American Studies and I am the academic director of the US Studies Centre here at the University of Sydney.
Great, couldn't be more cutting edge. So we go to our guest. Guest, can you please introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Will Noonan. I'm currently the equivalent of a senior lecturer in English and Translation Studies at the University of Burgundy in France, where I've been since 2012. I'm also a former student of this university for my bachelor's and then my doctorate. I did my honours year in English in 2004 along with Rod.
Oh, that's right. Perfect. Yeah. You know, even more cutting edge, like double cutting edge. I'm Ben, by the way. I always forget to say that, but you've heard of me.
Hi, Ben.
Hello, quite many times. So that's all good. And with that, we go to the very first question. Rodney, over to you there.
So, Will, can you tell us a bit about where humour and your work with humour has taken you so far? I mean, we mentioned we came through the university here together, so it can be both geographically and also with regards to your overall academic work.
Sure, and I think I can safely say that humour is where my interest in academic research started. It perhaps took me longer to realise it than I knew at the time. So I did my PhD, enrolled at the University of Sydney from 2005 through 2010, working on sort of humour and reflexivity in French and English literature.
It sounds so easy.
These are topics I've always been interested in, particularly this sort of reflexive function, which the kind of meta literature also led me to write chapters on Aristophanic comedy and on Don Quixote. I could read ancient Greek reasonably well at the time. I've never been able to read Spanish, so I don't know what I was doing with all of this.
That's great.
But this obsession with sort of humour and the meta function has sort of been a bit of a running thread through my career. That's taken me back and forth over the years between Australia and France. So I'd studied French before I began doing this. So I started working in sort of both French and English texts. My honours thesis was on Samuel Beckett's Endgame, the English text of which is full of jokes that are only funny to French speakers, the original French text of which is full of jokes that are only funny to English speakers. That's kind of where I started and have sort of moved on from there. So that's geographically as well as academically. I've continued to move on to other things in the meantime, partly following the demands of my employers.
Right.
But I've remained interested in humour.
It'd be a good thing to, listen to what the employer wants sometimes. So, and according, to your own research bio, and I had a cheeky quick look at your publications and your track record there. So I guess my next question would be, so how would you actually describe your work? And what areas are you working in? Is it humour, literature? Over to you. How would you describe it?
Okay, so humour, I'd probably say that I started out working on humour and literature, partly because my original training was in literary studies with a fairly large dose of literary theory. And so that's sort of where I got interested in this idea of kind of reflexivity. And I was always interested in literature running across languages, so written in different languages, those that I could read, those that I couldn't, but also running across time. I love 18th century novels. I love modernist literature. But what's always interested me was trying to actually think about the possible connections between dissimilar texts in dissimilar contexts.
Ooh, sounds dangerously comparativist.
Yes, so that's sort of one label that's been applied to me. But also I'm interested in this very unfashionable kind of new historicist point of view, where the idea is, well, how can we actually reconstruct at least a partial and necessarily subjective vision of the world behind a text, especially if it's not from a world we are familiar with.
So I've got the comparativist label, and off mic we can talk about other labels that have been applied to you, Will, perhaps. But thinking about this sort of movement between
bringing up the censorship
French and English, do you have a preference for working in humour in one or the other? And do you think there is a difference? And I think probably alluded to this earlier with your comment about Endgame, in how you can express your ideas for each linguistic audience.
This is a good question, and I think it has. We can talk about sort of humour, jokes or other sort of humour made in one language or another. And I think there is definitely something there. I mean, translating jokes is very difficult. sometimes because of language-specific features like wordplay, but more often because of differences in how people understand things. We all know that humour is very, very dependent on context. But also, if we're talking about how we study humour, there are wildly differing traditions of what we now call humour studies, which is, as we know, is a fairly recent discipline in terms of academic recognition. An example I keep going back to is that the word humour in English can mean more or less anything. It's completely dehistoricized, it's interdisciplinary, so it's a very useful word, except that it covers so many things that one goes to conferences and you then realize that, say, historian and psychologist often don't have very much to say to each other. They may or may not use the same words, but don't necessarily mean the same things by this.
I have a feeling this is like interdisciplinary shots fired kind of situation.
Completely. And this gets multiplied when you introduce different languages.
Can you just explain that a bit more? Because I think that's super
So,
interesting.
there's an idea that's fascinated me since the start of my doctoral thesis was the concept of humour has become completely dehistoricized in English. In French, at least, if you go and read a dictionary that gives etymologies, you'll see it's seen as a word borrowed from English around the middle of the 18th century, with sort of the meaning of kind of benevolence, so humour as opposed to, say, satire, but also this idea of kind of self-conscious eccentricity, the strange habit the English have of laughing at themselves rather than at other people. And so which gets us very, very close to the idea of kind of self-conscious literature, this kind of meta-humour and so on. And that's being able to see this sort of Englishness, in inverted commas, from the outside, I think has been very, very useful. It's not to say that it's universal in any one language. If you go to French-speaking Canada, there's a very, very interesting tradition of humour studies, except you then quickly realise that humour in Canadian French back translates into English as comedy. It's what a humorist does.
Right. Not to dump on the French or anybody else in. Go for it. Why not? Why not? No, but I was just wondering, before we move on to the next question there about a concept that I would really like to hear your thoughts about. But how would you then translate humor when you're working on it or with it as a concept? Are you using it more in the sense of comedy, or what is your understanding of humor?
I'm personally more interested in this kind of slightly old-fashioned sense that I just described from a French dictionary, this idea of kind of benevolent, self-conscious eccentricity, which was how the word came to be used in English before its meaning broadened. We used to talk about, say, ridicule or the comic in English in its broader way, and these terms have dropped out of use. So I'm very interested in sort of trying to recover something of that connection while also kind of keeping open the interdisciplinary toolbox.
Right. Okay. Well, sounds fair to me. Keep it open and have a bit of a.
It's cheating, in other words.
Yeah. Why not? Why not? So that being said, maybe we can go a bit further along the nerdy route here and have you talk a bit more about the idea of uneasy laughter, because I think it kind of ties nicely into the other questions of what are we actually using these terms for. And
okay. So uneasy laughter, if I remember correctly, is a quotation from the title of a book chapter I may have published.
Yes, you're right.
A long time ago, while a PhD student. And if I remember correctly, uneasy laughter here refers not to the relationship between humour and anxiety, though I think that's definitely there, but to the preface of Foucault's book, The Order of Things, where Foucault talks about Borges's Chinese encyclopedia, where we get this sort of absurd list of categories. And Foucault talks about his uneasy laughter as he reads this in Borges. What's always struck me about this is the idea that humour is, it's a little bit like holding the fool up to the king, things like that. Humour actually allows us, I think, to think about, well, of course the Chinese encyclopedia is absurd, but so ultimately is any other way of classifying knowledge.
Say it one more time for the people in the back.
So Borges' encyclopedia is absurd.
Perfect. This is for the French people out there.
But so ultimately is every other system of classifying knowledge. I'm not sure what part of that you wanted, but I'm happy to repeat both of them as many times as you wish.
I'm very pleased with that.
Seems like you're really going for something, Ben. I'm not sure what it is.
Well, you find out 10 episodes from now. Just wait until my scheme completely works out.
I see. And so uneasy laughter then, so it's the idea that sort of humour also allows us to sort of take a step back and look at things and to gain insights that we might not gain from a more sort of strictly speaking, sober, entirely rational approach, which is what I want to say, the sort of thing that allows us to think about what might be going on in, say, an ancient Greek comedy. I have no way of knowing whether the joke that I see in this text that's 2,500 years old is funny to me for the same reasons that it was to an audience. But there's sort of some sort of connection going on there. So this concept of uneasy laughter, but also the idea that, humour is a way of kind of constantly reflecting on problematizing things, that we need to actually take a step back. If I use what may now have become an unfashionable Australianism. I talked to my students in France today about the Australian concept of the bullshit detector.
How do they receive that idea?
They nod and smile and write it down.
See, this is what I mean, get those good patterns out. Yeah. And we have actually a good deal of time left. So with the last question, we can actually dive a bit more deeply in that.
So you're talking about sort of connections between fields, and you began by saying you were kind of always into humour studies without necessarily realising it to begin with. But I guess you've always been interested in translation, speaking at least 3 languages from what you've revealed today. So we've got humour studies on the one side, we've got translation studies on the other, which is what your position is in France. Do you think these fields are linked in any ways? And if so, what are those links? Are they productive links? Do they get in the way of each other?
Yep. I think there are sort of various possible productive links between these fields. I mean, firstly, again, I'm going to see if I can get a rise out of Ben here.
This is what I'm here for. Yeah.
I'm constantly arguing with my colleagues in France about that academic fields are not silos. They only they're tools, and they only exist to the extent that they are useful to us, and we need to remember that. I'm constantly arguing with people about this. But there are certainly kind of possible overlaps. I mean, the most obvious is perhaps the one we've already mentioned, that it's difficult to translate humour for reasons of language, but perhaps most importantly for reasons of culture and context. But trying to do that will also actually reveal something about the context we're trying to translate into, but perhaps even more about the context we're trying to translate out of. We have to really think about what's going on in order to translate a joke. Who's laughing? Why they're laughing? Are they laughing at? With? What anxieties is this betraying? And then how could we possibly try to reconstitute this in another language, another culture? Why, for whom? So all of those questions are there. When most of my teaching work these days involves training translators, and while most of the money in translation is in working with highly technical specialized texts and increasingly in using sort of managing technological automations to help do this, I often throw in some examples where humor is important. Not necessarily because my students are going to be translating comedy. This is sort of quite a rare sideline for us to be a very small number of people, but because it actually forces them to think. And once they've thought about that example, my hope is that they'll then go on to actually think more critically about others. So in that sense, perhaps especially in an increasingly technological world, humour is, I think, a very important tool in the armoury of critical thinking, which is important for translation and for translators, as I imagine it is in all sorts of other professions. Beyond translation between languages, I've also increasingly started working in the field of accessibility, so barrier-free communication, which could be, how to make, say, a film accessible to partially sighted or blind viewers through audio description, so questions like that. This may seem a very long way away from humour, but we've started to think a little bit about what are some of the creative possibilities of doing this. Some of the time we have to simply render a text, and let's say we have to render sort of informational content accessible in as simple and accessible a format as possible for the broadest number of users. And that would seem to militate against anything to do with humour. We're trying to be as literal as possible. And this could be for someone who has a cognitive impairment or somebody who is an L2 speaker of English, where the joke may not come across. On the other hand, it's extremely difficult to describe in words what's going on in a film. A picture stands in for 1,000 words, 24 frames per second. That's many, many thousands of words that we presumably would need to describe all of what's going on in the image of a film. So there's already a kind of an editorial decision to be made there. And the question we've started thinking about with a couple of colleagues is, firstly, if you had to, for example, try to make a humorous audiovisual production or digital production or something like a video game accessible, can you simply try to apply accessibility techniques in as sober and rational way as possible, or do you step away from it? So that's what's one question, or do you try to actually produce something that's sympathetic to the original text? And we can perhaps even go a step further, which is a little bit more controversial. Can, for example, a humorous description be a way of condensing information but also human reaction to visual information down in a way that can actually be presented in a very short space of time, even in the context of something that's not itself ostensibly humorous? This is going out on a little bit of a limb here, but it's something we started to think about as a way to actually see what we can do. And there's a lot of discussion about creative media accessibility and how this, the idea is we're moving away from rendering a single text accessible in the same way we're moving away from simply translating literally a text towards making a new text that actually has its own aesthetic value and that's actually can be appreciated by different audiences.
And with that, we're really on the dot at 15 minutes. Perfect. Thanks so much. We couldn't have said it better, literally. That's why we're inviting our guests on to say so themselves. Will, thanks so much for being here with us, humoring us. Rodney, any last words for?
No, thanks very much. And we'll tease out this anti-Frenchness of Ben's across the course of this series.
Well, we fix it in post if we have to. Thanks so much, Will, for being here.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Rod. It's been nice to be here again.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks very much.